I was born on August 31, 1941, just over 2 months before the onset of World War II. My early years were very much a product of the times in which I grew up. One imprint was the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the other was the war in the 1940s. In 1941, my parents had both been school teachers, but my father was very quickly realizing that $75 a month in income was insufficient for his growing family. So he returned to logging and lumbering, and my mother left teaching to become a housewife and mother. When I was a boy, we lived 14 miles from town by riverboat up the South Fork of Coos River, and at the head of Tidewater, we then walked nearly a mile through the forest to a cabin that my parents rented. It had no electricity, no running water, no indoor toilet. My father was building and operating splash dams to drive logs for the Coos River Boom Company on the South Fork of Coos River. Once a week, my mother and I would walk to Delwood with a load of dirty clothes, and I was just a kiddo tagging along with her. And we boarded the riverboat and stopped at each farm on the way to town to take on the milk cans. And the boat then reached the Coos Bay Mutual Creamery in Coos Bay to deliver the milk for processing. My Swedish grandparents met us at the boat, and I went with them in the dirty clothes to their home several blocks away to do the laundry. And my mother walked to town to purchase groceries for the week. And then about 4 o'clock, we boarded the boat and headed back up the river. And at each farm, at each landing, the men on the boat delivered the mail, and they set off the empty milk cans. And those are some of my earliest memories of conditions. Before I started kindergarten, my parents had planted cranberry bogs in the western part of the Coos Bay area, and we moved to a home, a cabin at the bog. There was no running water. There was a pitcher pump that you pumped like this, and I took my bath in the kitchen sink with the water being pumped up from underneath the house. There was an outdoor toilet in the backyard, and rather primitive conditions, which my parents quickly amended by adding 2 bedrooms and a full bathroom to the little house. So as a boy, I was early introduced into a work ethic, and part of that was helping my parents by pulling willows and tussocks in the bog, and also helping pick cranberries in the fall of the year, something that continued while I was into high school years, as long as my parents were members of the Ocean Spray Cranberry Cooperative. When I was in 3rd grade, we moved into town to a new home. That was in 1949. A very nice, comfortable home that my parents had purchased. And I then had only a 2-block jaunt to elementary school. And I lived only about 10 blocks from my Swedish grandparents. My maternal grandfather and grandmother had immigrated from Sweden. My grandfather came in 1884 when he was 15 years old. He ran away on a sailing ship and went first to South Africa and then to Port Adelaide, Australia, where he had his portrait taken, and entered the United States at San Francisco. He became a career federal employee with the U.S. Life-Saving Service and the U.S. Lighthouse Service on the Columbia River in southeast Alaska, and in 1911 took the posting at Coos Bay, Oregon. My grandmother was a surgical nurse from Uppsala University in Sweden, where she was a student in the 1890s, and single, and at loose ends in 1909, she decided to come to Oregon for 2 years to work in a hospital in Astoria, Oregon, because she had Swedish friends living there. And that in 1911, my Swedish grandparents met and married in Astoria, and moved to Coos Bay. They were a significant influence on my life. I spent a lot of weekends with my next younger brother, David, who was born in 1943, staying with my grandmother, who was a widow by 1944. My paternal grandparents I knew very little about. My father's mother, Claudia Beckham, died in 1921 when he was 10 years old. She died in childbirth on a farm in Oklahoma. My grandfather Beckham, Romulus Beckham, lived in retirement in Bandon, Oregon, south down the coast. So I didn't see very much of Grandpa Beckham at all when I was a child, and he died in 1947. Very important, I think, in my upbringing was the range of interest of my parents. They loved nature, they loved activity, and they took their boys into as many experiences as possible. We learned, for example, that the Dalles Dam was going to be built and it would flood Celilo Falls. My parents took us to Celilo to see the falls, to hear the roar of the river, to watch the Indians fishing, and to visit the archaeological excavations at Wake Map Mound or 5 Mile Rapids on the north bank of the river. When Dr. Luther Cressman found vegetable fiber sandals in the Fort Rock Cave in excavations both in the 1930s and then again after World War II, we set out for Fort Rock to visit the northern reaches of Lake County and see that archaeological site. In 1930, my father, his brother, and twin cousins decided to walk home from Southern Oregon College in Ashland through the canyon of the Rogue River. So as a boy, we returned with my father to the Rogue River Canyon over and over again to camp, to fish, to look for arrowheads on the riverbank. Those were the type of experiences that my parents gave us that really influenced my interest in nature and in history. I was fortunate as a child to live in a very unique nuclear family. A mom and a dad who were kind and very caring and nurturing, who believed in education and believed in a good work ethic. Thus, when I was 10 and my brother David was 8.5 or 9, we both took over and split a paper route. And we delivered the Coos Bay Times, later known as the Coos Bay World, to about 60 neighborhood homes. That was important in learning about work. And in time, with my push lawnmower, I took on multiple yard jobs to work in the neighborhood. Probably one of the most formative long-term experiences, however, was the Boy Scout movement. I started as a Cub Scout and then became a Boy Scout. And my father had been a Scoutmaster, but never of the troop in which I was to be a Boy Scout. And I found then my love of the outdoors and curiosity about all sorts of subjects like Indian lore and nature and first aid and world affairs and photography to be a pathway of discovery through the Merit Badge program in Boy Scouts. And I was pretty aggressive about these things. I had a lot of determination to excel. So by the time I was 14, I'd become an Eagle Scout, a member of the Order of the Arrow, and other adventures beckoned. Probably the most significant formative moment was the opportunity in 1957 to go with my brother David to the Boy Scout Jamboree in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where we traveled by train across the United States with other scouts. And then David turned around to return to Coos Bay, Oregon, but I was part of Troop 111, a troop of Eagle Scouts from Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. And we journeyed then to Quebec and then by ship to Plymouth, England, to spend 10 days at the World Boy Scout Jamboree at Sutton Coldfield. And then following that, we traveled all the way from Amsterdam to Munich to Vienna to Venice to Nice to Paris, to Le Havre, and got a very good introduction to European culture and the affairs following World War II. The damage from the war was still evident, particularly in London, Frankfurt, Munich, and Vienna, where we could see destroyed blocks and buildings from World War II. The other side of it was the railroad depots were wonderful new structures built under the Marshall Plan by the United States. So I had an encounter with history and world affairs that was highly formative. To make that trip, I had taken on a second paper route, the Morning Oregonian. So I got up usually around 5:30 in the dark and the rain, and with my canvas bag and bicycle, I set out to deliver 90 daily Oregonians, a few more on Sundays, through the neighborhood. And then after high school, I came home and mowed lawns and delivered the local newspaper. So those were elements that I think really helped shape who I was going to become. My family belonged to the First Baptist Church, and we attended church every Sunday, including Sunday school. I was a bit questioning about the Bible stories that we encountered, but I certainly learned a good code of ethics and behavior that were imparted through that religious upbringing. College. College happened to be a very happy experience for me. High school was okay, and I was a class officer and editor of the high school yearbook 25 years after my mother had done the same at Marshfield High School in Coos Bay. But highly significant was the discovery of broader worlds starting in the fall of 1959. I enrolled at the University of Oregon and was a biology major. That was okay, but my interest kept straying into the humanities. And in my fourth year, after being admitted to dental school in California and at the University of Oregon Dental School in Portland, I decided that that was not my future, that I didn't want to spend the next 40 years of my life looking in somebody's mouth. So I switched gears and said to my father, I don't want to go to dental school. Well, that was quite a crisis in my Christmas of my fourth year in college. And I remember my father, Dow Beckham, said, well, Steve, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to do history. And he said, how can you make a living doing history? I said, just give me a chance. I'll show you what I can do with it. So I took additional courses in history, applied to 4 graduate schools and was admitted to all 4 of them. And I chose what I thought was the best in the country, a top 10 school, UCLA. And I headed off to Los Angeles in my mother's 1955 Chevrolet car. I'd never seen the campus, but I knew that UCLA had a formidable reputation. I was prepared to go there because my undergraduate advisor in history, Edwin Bingham at the University of Oregon, had said to me, if you get into UCLA, I'll write you a letter of introduction to my graduate advisor at UCLA. So when I arrived in Los Angeles in the fall of 1964, I went to see John Walton Coy, who had nurtured more than 20 doctoral students in history. And he said, oh, you're the Beckham boy from University of Oregon. I said, yes. And he said, well, do you want to do a thesis or do you want to do an exam for your master's degree? I said, well, Dr. Coy, I'd really like to do the thesis. And he said, why? I said, well, there's a topic I would like to write about and research. It's the Rogue River Indian Wars of southwestern Oregon and northern California during the gold rush in the 1850s. He said, well, are there any books on that subject? And I said, well, the best account was published in 1884. And I said, there's really been no modern research or publication. He said, that sounds very promising. He said, how about you bringing me a bibliography in 2 weeks? And I reached down and I handed him a couple hundred bibliography cards. And I said, this is my beginning research work list. He said, all right, then you sign up for the seminar on Western history, and I'd like to see the first chapter of your thesis by the end of this semester. So that's how it began. And in very short order, during the 2 years I worked on my master's degree, I wrote a thesis called The Rogue Indians and the Frontiersmen, and then submitted it for publication. And it became my first book, Requiem for a People, The Rogue Indians and the Frontiersmen, finally published in 1972. It took a while to get it through press, but I'm proud to say that now, in the year 2022, 50 years later, it is still available in print as a paperback book, first published by University of Oklahoma Press and now by Oregon State University Press. So I had a fortuitous series of events happen. Not only did John Coy become my graduate advisor, but he looked at me and he said, "You're ambitious and like to work?" I said, "Oh, yes, I do." He said, "Well, I have a position open for my editorial assistant on the Pacific Historical Review, which was a journal published by the American Historical Association." So for the next 3 years, I became assistant to the editor of the Pacific Historical Review, which was a fabulous opportunity. I had my own office in the 9th floor of Bunch Hall at UCLA. I solicited publishers for books to be reviewed. I read galley proofs. I indexed the volumes. I was learning American history inside and out and getting paid for the experience. Consequently, because I was earning money rather than spending money as a graduate student, I put enough aside so that in 1965, I was able to enroll at Oxford University in England. I took 3 courses, but my main purpose in being at Oxford was to be able to do research at the British Museum, the Public Record Office, and the Hudson's Bay Company archives for what was becoming the book Requiem for a People. I got a taste of a European university education, but also did research in remarkable primary sources that no other scholar had used previously. When I returned to UCLA, I started the PhD program immediately. There was some pressure because of the war in Vietnam and the prospect of being drafted, which was the fate of my younger brother David, who, while he was in graduate school at the University of Oregon, faced the draft and thus enrolled in the advanced ROTC program. He received his master's degree in business and his commission as a second lieutenant and was sent to Germany and then to Vietnam. Whereas I fortunately kept studying and got married in 1967 and consequently was not drafted into the Army for the Vietnam War. When I got married in August of 1967, I married Patricia Joan Cox, and I had known Patty all my life. We happened to have been delivered by the same doctor in Coos Bay, Oregon. Our parents and grandparents knew each other. Our parents were friends. About 1950, when Patty's father took a job in Medford as a principal, my mother took over his teaching position at Roosevelt Junior High School in North Bend, Oregon. So it was interesting that eventually our parents ended up with the same grandchildren, Andrew and Anne Marie, born in 1973 and 1976. When I was finished doing my PhD at UCLA, I'd kept running onto a name, George Gibbs. He appeared in a lot of the early records of the American West Coast, Oregon, Washington, California in particular. So I decided that I would do a biography for my dissertation. And here I am, nearly 60 years later, still using Gibbs materials as an expert witness in court. Gibbs had come out on the Oregon Trail from his law practice in New York in 1849. He spent 11 years on the West Coast frontier as an ethnographer, linguist, surveyor, cartographer, treaty council secretary, and writer of natural history materials for the Pacific Railroad reports in the Smithsonian. So he was an ideal choice for a dissertation topic. I learned early on that if you put down one foot and then another, or one shingle and another shingle and another shingle, pretty soon you can cover the ground and you have a roof over a building. And that's how it was with academic life. I found one project and another project, and it covered another and then built upon another. And that has sort of been the way my professional career has evolved. In 1969, seeing that the Pacific Northwest seemed wide open for research, and having family in Oregon, Patty and I left our teaching jobs in Long Beach, California, and loaded the U-Haul truck and headed north to McMinnville. I had taken an appointment as an assistant professor at Linfield College, and Patty became a music teacher at Dundee and Central Schools in Dundee and Newberg, Oregon. Linfield College was not quite my idea of where I wanted to be, but it was a convenient location, and it helped ramp my career up significantly. During that period, between 1967 and 1970, I was serving on the Study Commission on Denominational Structure to reshape the whole polity of the American Baptist churches in the United States. I was the representative of young Baptists under the age of 30. I served on a commission with nearly 20 theologians, scholars, lay people, and church leaders from all over the U.S. And during that 3-year period, I probably made 25 to 30 trips, either to Valley Forge, Philadelphia, or Chicago for meetings. I came to understand very early in my career then a process of group decision-making and conflict resolution. The chair of the study commission was Ambrose L. Cram, an attorney at 1 Wall Street in New York City. Ambrose, who was my father's age, and I became very close friends. In the Thanksgiving of 1970, when we were living in McMinnville, Ambrose said to me that fall, "You and your wife seem to really like living in Oregon. Would it be okay if my wife and I came to visit you?" Well, they did. They came out Thanksgiving week to visit us in Oregon. Ambrose retired from his law firm. His wife left her job at a college in New York, and they both joined the faculty and staff at Linfield College. Mary Frances in the dean's office and Ambrose as assistant to the president. And though they were our parents' age, they were our fast friends during our young married years. Ambrose taught me a very important lesson as he chaired the Study Commission on Denominational Structure. He said, "Stephen, there are some dissident voices in this room." And he said, "We don't want to muzzle them, we need to hear them." He said, "You must draw out the most discomforting, confrontational people in the group process and let them be heard, and give them an assignment. And if they're heard and really listened to, you have a chance then of reaching conflict resolution and moving forward." What a wonderful lesson that was for me. And I used it over and over again in the committees that I chaired during the years I was a college professor. I always tried to get the most contrary, difficult person on the faculty involved in the deliberations and process so that they would support us rather than shooting us down when the recommendations came in for faculty action. In 1972, money became available for the newly created Oregon Committee for the Humanities. I heard about that, and I thought, I could use some of that money. There's something I would like to do. So I applied and secured a grant of $2,000 to give 6 lectures from the mouth of the Columbia River to the California border under the theme, "This Land Was Theirs, the Indians of the Oregon Coast." I little realized how timely those lectures would be. Each of them was illustrated. And I remember on a dark and rainy night, I was speaking at the Riley Creek Elementary School in Gold Beach, Oregon, and we had over 300 people turn out for that lecture in that little coastal town. With that remarkable success, more than 1,200 people attending the 6 lectures, I went back to the Oregon Council for the Humanities and applied for a whopping $3,500 to do a television series. And I actually got $3,700 to film, interview, research, script write, and narrate the TV series. Well, that was just a token amount of the money that it cost. But I was able to take that money to Oregon Public Broadcasting, OPB, and to KOIN TV, Channel 6, CBS affiliate in Portland. I was aware that the Federal Communications System had pointed out that KOIN lacked minority programming. They were in a bind over their license. So I went to the station manager, had an interview, and I said, I have some programs that will help give you minority programming. And they agreed. And so we did all of the filming at KOIN studios between the 6 o'clock news and the 10 o'clock news, using their studio, their cameras, their staff, their sound person, their staff artist to do the 6 half-hour color high band TV shows. Well, the TV series, which then aired 8 times, either on CBS or OPB, and the lecture series, and the publication in 1972 of the book Requiem for a People, put my name before a big public. I'd also published The Simpsons of Shore Acres in 1972, a volume that has sold over 35,000 copies. And then in 1974, Tall Tales from Rogue River with the Indiana University Press, that also went through 10 printings, including a half dozen in paperback. So those publications really started to ground me in the world of scholarship and college teaching and public profile. In 1973, directly as a consequence of the television series, I was contacted by tribal organizations in Oregon and Washington who explained that they were in a terrible predicament. They were either non-federally recognized or legislatively terminated by Congress. They were Indian, but they had no status as federally recognized tribes. So at their request, I joined a tribal delegation of 4 from the Small Tribes Organization of Western Washington to fly to Washington, D.C. and walk the halls of Congress to make the case for looking at the predicament of West Coast tribes. Senator James Aberesk of South Dakota and Representative Lloyd Meads from Washington State made my appointments. That led, interestingly, in 1976 to the hearings of the Joint Congressional Commission on the American Indian for the Task Force on Non-Federally Recognized and Terminated Tribes. And I was a witness in those congressional hearings. And ultimately, those ventures in the 1970s changed history, because in 1977, Congress began restoring tribes to a federal relationship. And I was intimately involved, directly involved in those, including testifying several times before Senate and House committees in Washington, D.C. My journey in life also went in another direction beyond college teaching, from classroom to courtroom, starting in 1979. I was asked to serve as expert witness in the Columbia River Indian tribal fishing rights cases on behalf of the Wahkiakum, Cowlitz, and Chinook tribes. And that was my first foray into working as an expert witness. And I learned a lot of lessons really quickly about how to do that. Never take notes into the courtroom. Have your father, if possible, in the courtroom and listening to the conversations in the elevator during the breaks. Speaking directly to the lawyers, to the audience, and looking at the judge and storing your mind with lots of useful information. In that very first trial, my opposing expert witness, Dr. Vern Frederick Ray, who had done more than 20 cases before the Indian Claims Commission, brought in handfuls of notes on 4x5 cards. He got up in the witness box and he dropped all the notes, and they went all over the floor of the courtroom. And from then on, he was not a very good witness. He lost his place. By 1975, with 4 books published in the TV series and being named an associate professor at Linfield College, I started getting nibbles. And there was a nibble that I really liked. The dean at Lewis and Clark College and the president opened a conversation saying, we would like to build upon the school's name and location, and we would like you to get to know the faculty in Portland. Well, to expedite that, Lewis and Clark named me as an external member of the Tenure and Review Commission at the college. So during Christmas break in 1975 and 1976, I traveled back and forth to Portland to review personnel files and serve on Lewis and Clark's Promotion and Tenure Committee. I liked what I saw. I saw a really talented faculty in a school that was in a great location. Also, Lewis and Clark had a law school and a law library that intrigued me considerably. So in the 1977, in the spring of 1977, I was offered employment that fall at Lewis and Clark. This was a very tough time for Patty because she had a thriving career as a music teacher in the Newburgh district, and we had 2 children, Andrew born in 1973 and Anne-Marie born in 1976. But we decided to sell our home in McMinnville, take a big gulp and buy a home in Lake Oswego, reduce our income to 1 salary, and move with the 2 children to the Portland metropolitan area. The decision was certainly the right decision at the right time. And eventually Patty would return to teaching in the Lake Oswego schools, and then she became an adjunct professor teaching music education at Lewis and Clark, and then became assistant principal of Lake Oswego High School, and then 20 years ago became a real estate broker when she retired from her career in education. In the meantime, I had a long 32-year tenure of teaching at Lewis and Clark, which was truly a wonderful career move. The prospects kept opening in the 1980s and the 1990s. One of the things that I did with curiosity was to take a special appointment in 1976, my last year at Linfield, to help develop an historic inventory for the state of Oregon. I traveled 22,000 miles, worked in every county in Oregon, and photographed and documented and wrote file sheets on just over 1,800 buildings that year, and then subsequently several hundred more. That project became the database for the State Historic Preservation Office. It also precipitated my role in serving on the State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation that handles the National Register program. And now 50 years later, I'm a chair of that same committee. A poetic return for 9 years now of service, a second time by appointment of the Oregon governors. So in addition to Native Americans and Western history, historic preservation became another career option and interest of mine. By 1990, because of burgeoning heritage tourism in the American West, both federal agencies and local groups became interested in enhancing their museums or building interpretive centers. And a lot of this involved natural history and history. here came a whole new career option and opening for me. So in 1990, I came on board to research and write the National Historic Oregon Trail Center at Baker City, the Columbia Gorge Interpretive Center at Stevenson, Washington, the Columbia Gorge Discovery Center and Wasco County Museum in the Dalles, the Cape Disappointment Interpretive Center at the mouth of the Columbia River, the Yaquina Head Interpretive Center at Agate Beach, the Jones Creek Interpretive Center for the Tillamook State Forest in the Coast Range of Oregon, the Barlow Road Interpretive Program, the Applegate Trail Interpretive Program, the master plan for the museum in Hong Kong, the History Museum in Kowloon, and a major project for the Center for the Book at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. So my classrooms moved from the campus of Lewis and Clark College to museums and interpretive centers all the way from Washington, D.C. to the mainland and China in terms of educational programming. I was thrilled with that because I thought that history was something that should be of interest and shared with all people of all ages, not just college students. And I found that each of these projects that I took on enriched my teaching. It gave me new experiences, introduction to new materials and subjects that I could infuse into the courses that I was teaching on campus. In terms of my teaching assignment, Lewis and Clark College gave me a long tether. I did my very best to build upon the school's name, upon the school's location, and to teach whenever I could field-based programs. So for several summers, 3 summers with a regular summer school and 3 programs for the trustees of the college, we retraced the Lewis and Clark route from the Bitterroot Valley of Montana to the Pacific Ocean. Those were great courses, taught on foot, on canoe, on horseback, camping out, and really stepping into history. 8 other summers, I taught Indians in the Northwest Coast, where we chartered sailboats and went from the Straits of Georgia all the way up to the Johnstone Straits at the northern end of Vancouver Island to visit archaeological sites, museums, reservations, and hear Native American informants. Through the public administration programs at Lewis and Clark College, I taught in more than 30 intensive semester seminar programs for federal agency people who were spending 30 days returning to college at Lewis and Clark. And my assignment was usually 10 to 12 days of the field-based seminar. So we went 6 times to the Rio Grande Valley. We went 8 times to Southeast Alaska. We visited Prudhoe Bay and Kaktovik on the Arctic Ocean. We looked at acid rain in New England. We visited the TVA at Norris, Tennessee. We did 2 studies of the farm crisis in Washington County, Iowa. We studied water distribution systems on the Big Thompson at Greeley, Colorado. And all of this was on top of my regular teaching assignment on campus. It was a scramble many times because I had to make sure that my students were receiving their regular instruction on campus while I was doing the special programs for the college off campus. But somehow we survived. And we survived in part because Patty kept the home fires burning and the kids fed. I was gone an awful lot, but it was a very fulfilling career experience to be involved. I also continued, fortunately, to have very positive ongoing relationships with tribes. Now in the year 2022, when I look back, I've testified in 41 court cases or judicial matters, written dozens of expert witness reports, provided thousands and thousands of pages of documents that have been submitted as evidence or exhibits in court, and have addressed a variety of issues. Currently, I'm serving in the Oswego Lake case, which is my 11th case as an expert witness in public access to navigable waters in Oregon. In 9 of those cases, I've been the state's witness, and 2 others for non-state interests about the navigation servitude or the public trust doctrine about public use of navigable waterways. The other cases have involved 21 tribes across the United States, from the Oneida and the Seneca in New York, to the Eastern Pequot in Connecticut, the Ottawa, the Delaware, and the Quapaw in Oklahoma, 14 different tribes in California, and then the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua, Kushlor-Umpqua, Siuslaw, Grand Ronde tribes, Cowlitz tribe, Chinook tribe, and others in Oregon and Washington. In 1989, after the restoration of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua in 1982, the tribe was, and I'd served as their expert witness in the U.S. Claims Court over their treaty lands in 1855. They were ready to embark upon economic development. So I called upon my youngest brother, Mark Beckham, born in 1954, and his wife, Cynthia, who had done her law degree at Lewis and Clark College. And the 3 of us researched and wrote a business plan for the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua. The tribe had an 11-acre tract with a beat-up old motel on the north edge of Canyonville, Oregon. But it was on the main route of I-5, the interstate freeway, down the west coast of North America. And we thought that there was promise. And we looked first at the development of a firewood business, and then a jam and jelly business. And those were cottage industries with lots of labor and no profit. And then the prospect arose of maybe a bingo hall. So Brother Mark visited bingo halls in the East and eventually in Europe. I did the traffic volume counts, and Cynthia did a lot of the economic factors. And we brought in a business plan that envisioned a gaming operation that would start with bingo, and then keno, and then eventually machines and roulette and other games of chance. Well, it just happened that by 1990, their very clever attorney, Dennis Whittlesey, with whom I'd worked for a decade in court, was able to secure the first tribal gaming pact in Oregon between an Indian tribe and the state under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. I was named that year to the board of the Umpqua Indian Development Corporation. 5 tribal members, 4 non-tribal. And the 4 of us who were non-tribal brought real-world experience and business experience to the 5 tribal members, and we proceeded forthwith to establish the Seven Feathers Casino. Today, it's an enterprise that has a gross income of around $270 million a year in Canyonville, Oregon. It's a casino, hotel, truck and travel center, spa, convenience store, hydroelectric project, electric company. They have a diversified economy, and they are the 2nd largest employer in Douglas County, Oregon. So my work from classroom to courtroom to the business world transitioned in many interesting ways over the last 60 years. And I'm really pleased to see the impact that modern tribal economies have had on lives. People who were impoverished are employed. People with very poor medical care now have clinics and dental care paid for by tribal income. People who wanted an education can get an education through the tribal initiatives. And the tribes, interestingly, have now become philanthropists. They are giving money through their tribal enterprises to other nonprofits to help make this be a better world. In the 1990s, I had avoided becoming involved in Lewis and Clark's off-campus study programs. I was teaching regularly for Stanford University, and I did a dozen seminars for Stanford on horseback in Montana, on Trans-Canada by rail, and on small cruise ships with 65 passengers in Southeast Alaska. But my former students at Lewis and Clark kept persuading me that I needed to go to Africa. Stefan Amack, who'd been my research assistant in the early 1990s, was among those. And after his return from the Peace Corps in Ghana, he said, "Come on, Professor Beckham, let's go to Africa." So in 1997, we flew to Kenya and lined up outfitters and instructors. And then in January 1998, we departed from Portland, Oregon with 25 students for a long sojourn from January to May in East Africa. I refer to this as a long deferred midlife crisis. I didn't have time for it, but in 1998, daughter Anne-Marie was in her senior year, final semester at Lewis and Clark College. My wife was busy as assistant principal at the high school, so off I went. And it was a high adventure trip. It was very much like what I did in Boy Scouts. No suitcases, backpacks only. And we moved every couple weeks in East Africa. We started out in the Malepo Hills with the Swahili instructors. We broke the class into 5 cook groups of 5 students each, and each had a Swahili instructor. And then we flew to Lamu on the coast. I chartered a couple dhows or wooden sailing ships, and we headed north to coastal Somalia. The Indian Ocean coastline was absolutely breathtakingly beautiful, with mangrove swamps, islands, and mostly deserted villages because of the troubles in Somalia. We spent a sojourn at Malindi and Mombasa, studying Swahili language and culture and archaeology. A trip to the island of Zanzibar for the spice trade and the colonization by the Omanis and then the Portuguese in East Africa. We were in Nairobi for lectures at the National Museum with Dr. Meave Leakey on paleontology, and the students then launched their independent research projects. We took a week off. The students did independent travel, and I flew down to Amboseli National Park at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro. We then made an expedition on camelback through Laikipia in the highlands of central Kenya, and then north to the Laroki Forest for encounters with elephants and giraffes and other big critters. And then the high point, I think, of the whole trip was going to Ngorongoro on the slopes of Mount Kenya and climbing the mountain. We made a trek of 10 days, 104 linear miles. We crossed the equator on foot twice. We climbed to Lanana Summit at 15,555 feet elevation. That was an arduous experience for an old professor, all of whose students were half his age. We split into 2 groups, and we went from opposite directions and met at around 14,000 feet, camped together, and then did the summit climb as one group. We set out at 4 a.m. with headlamps in the ice and the snow, high on that mountain peak. And at dawn, we watched the sun come up over the Indian Ocean, ripple across the land, and illuminate Mount Kilimanjaro far to the south on that distant horizon in Tanzania. A really, truly remarkable experience. So when I got home, I was able to tell my son and daughter, Dad has just climbed a really remarkable mountain 1 mile higher than Mount Hood in Oregon. It was a strenuous, interesting expedition. And I think all 25 students and outfitter Stefan and his brother Ethan and myself benefited greatly from that challenge. In 2003, life began to change rapidly when both our son and daughter were married that summer.
My next younger brother, David, and I were married the same week in 1967. Our son and daughter were married the same month in 2003. Their marriages then coincided with getting them settled in homes. Patty and I had a ski house in Summit County at Park City, Utah. We sold that and repositioned the assets to help the kids invest in property. Daughter and son-in-law purchased a home in Southwest Portland, and our son and daughter-in-law, Andrea, from Salt Lake City, purchased a vineyard property or a rural property that they converted by 2005 and 6 into the Beckham Estate vineyard. That was also the time that Patty and I, thinking that we might have grandchildren, made a big decision. We purchased a cottage at South Beach in Nescoin, Oregon. I'd first seen the house in 1975 when I was doing the archaeological survey of the Cascade Head National Scenic Area for the Siuslaw National Forest. It was a charming little building. It was one of the 3 pioneer cottages built in 1911, 1912, and 1913. And ours was the 3rd of those. It had been built by 2 families from McMinnville. And we were the 3rd owner occupants when we bought it in 2004. The little house was in pretty bad shape. So son Andrew and I then spent most of 2 years jacking the house up, hand digging footings, pouring a full concrete foundation, bringing the house back down, winterizing it for the first time with insulation and studs to hold up the balloon frame construction, and converting the house from a sleeping loft into 3 bedrooms and a bathroom in the upper story. Then with the advent of grandchildren, with the birth of Sophia and soon 5 others, we decided that the cottage was too small. So we added a south wing, very well designed by architect David Slusharenko from Portland, and we doubled the size of the property. Well, this was a big investment of energy and resources, but it really paid off because it has become a trap for the 6-pack of grandchildren who have repeatedly spent their holidays, 4th of July week, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and other events at the home at Nescoin. It has really paid off in terms of the investment, and I think the bonding and building of family relationships over generations. The past 35 years of my life, in addition to teaching, and then in 2011, reluctant retirement from the classroom, have been greatly enriched by the opportunity to work with modern tribes. And that engagement has involved litigation research, congressional research, and rather extensively documentation of the status of tribal lands, particularly to qualify them under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act for economic development, namely casinos. To date, I've worked with 14 tribes in California, 4 tribes in Oklahoma, as well as a number of tribes in Oregon and Washington. And my great gratification has been able to see tribes take charge of their own destiny. Working with tribal councils and their lawyers has been a very interesting experience in seeing modern Native Americans launch their own economic projects. Through casinos, they've generated the dollars to create hospitality services, spas, hotels, truck and travel centers, convenience stores, RV parks, and then diversify their investments into other enterprises. With the dollars earned, they've been able to employ both tribal members and non-tribal members living in rural areas. They've been able to provide health services, fire services, ambulance assistance in places that were not well served previously. And then, of course, there have been funds available for education of tribal members and improvement of housing and elders' benefits. So the work of a historian has had an interesting dimension. It has led into the achievement of projects of which I am particularly proud, namely the bettering of lives, the expanding of opportunities for Native Americans, particularly along the west coast of the United States. That has been a really special part of life. Nearly 20 years after I had worked with the Summers collection at the British Museum in London, I received an invitation from David Harrelson, my former history student at Lewis and Clark and member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, to write the exhibit catalog for a remarkable experience. It had taken more than 2 decades of negotiation for the Grand Ronde people to secure a loan agreement from the British Museum in London to bring select items from the Reverend Robert Summers collection to exhibit at their Chalu Tribal Museum. Reverend Summers was an Episcopalian minister in McMinnville in the 1870s, and he traveled, wrote diaries, and collected avidly Native American material culture. These collections had never been exhibited and were deposited at the British Museum in 1900 by a friend of Reverend Summers. The tribe was able to secure this loan agreement, the first time a Native American tribe had ever been able to borrow from the British Museum. And my assignment was to research and document what Summers did and the objects that were in the exhibit. Well, this led to a really wonderful experience and the publication of a handsome book called Rise of the Collectors that involved covering the historical and ethnographic context of the objects of material culture of the Kalapuya and coastal Indians of Western Oregon, whose works were so handsomely represented in the Summers collection. The catalog was published in 2018, and for a year, the objects from London were on display at the Tribal Museum in Grand Ronde, Oregon. This was the culmination of the research that started when I was in London in 1998, and it took 20 years to get to completion. Another event that was of considerable interest to me. I've been involved in historic preservation in Oregon since the 1970s. And about the year 2003, 2004, I thought, I teach in a really remarkable place. I'm going to research and write an account about Lewis and Clark College's heritage properties. Those included the estate known as 4 Acres that had been developed by Lloyd and Edna Frank in the 1920s. It's the undergraduate campus with buildings and 12 acres of landscaped grounds, a really stunning setting on Southwest Palatine Hill Road. Then in 2000, the college had a fortuitous gift of $5 million from Miss Harriet Corbett that leveraged the opportunity for the college to purchase the Corbett Mansion, the Hamilton and Harriet Corbett property that became South Campus. That was a complicated negotiation through the Office of the Realty at the Vatican because the Sisters of St. Francis had owned the property from 1947 to the year 2000. The college was successful in that negotiation, and it acquired approximately 18 acres of grounds and the stunning Corbett Mansion that became the graduate campus for Lewis and Clark College. Also in that period, around 2001 or 2002, Sue Cooley, widow of Ed Cooley of Precision Cast Parts in Portland, gave the Cameron and Claire Squires estate to the college to be the home of the college president. It's today known as Cooley House. That property was designed by Ellis Lawrence, first dean of architecture at the University of Oregon. It is an estate of approximately 8 acres with Tudor Revival mansion, outdoor swimming pool, pergolas, greenhouse, and stunning landscaped grounds that were developed in 1928 by Olmsted Brothers of Brookline, Massachusetts. So with those three remarkable properties in mind, I wrote the volume Fortune and Friendship, Lewis and Clark's Heritage Properties. It was not expected by the college that I would do this. And I remember the college president at the time saying, well, we can't afford to print that book. And I said to him, you don't have anything to give to alums and friends of the college. You need this book. And I was quite disappointed, and I walked back to my office. Then I called him up a couple hours later, and I said, Tom, give me permission. I'll go out and raise the money to get that book published. Well, that leverage did it, and the college printed the book. And it's been a very popular paperback that is sold regularly in the campus bookstore. It also was a real chance to speak to the stewardship that the Board of Trustees have exercised in the maintenance of the 3 major homes and the grounds that surround them. And I think it's one of the reasons why Lewis and Clark is often singled out as one of the most beautiful campuses in the United States. Its heritage properties are really a key to the setting for educational enterprises. Retirement. I'd had no intention to retire from teaching, but in 2011, I had a stroke. I didn't realize that I had a poorly functioning heart because of a malfunctioning gene that was not sending electrical signals to the ventricle. That was a sobering moment. And I was very appreciative of the college reducing my teaching load the last year I was at Lewis and Clark. I then had a very difficult period that involved a liver surgery as well. And then I got back in the saddle. If I'd only known that I was going to recover by 2013, I probably would have taken a leave and would have kept on teaching. However, the college did draw on me for other events. But I particularly enjoyed teaching for the travel study programs for Lewis and Clark alumni. And one of the most memorable of those has been 3 summer expeditions on the sailing ship, the Zodiac, a 160-foot vessel based in Bellingham, Washington, that was built in the 1920s for the Johnson & Johnson pharmaceutical family, that is now a charter vessel available for groups on Puget Sound and the Straits of Georgia. Over the summers, I have had wonderful reconnections with 25 alumni each summer or their spouses when we have sailed on the Zodiac. It's been a chance for fellowship, for the delivery of evening lectures on board, and also to play some of the CDs of my late friend, the Carver Laluska, who was a marvelous raconteur of Northwest Coast Indian tales. I had written the introduction or foreword to his book, Echoes of the Elders, published shortly before his death in the mid-1990s. And the 2 volumes of Northwest Coast Indian tales each came not only with his illustrations, but with CDs. And those recordings are absolutely magical. So on the Zodiac each evening, using a boombox brought by my former student, John Mashofsky, we were able to share different Northwest Coast Indian tales in the beautiful setting of the San Juan Islands or the Gulf Islands in British Columbia. Those are magical moments, and it's been a thrill of a lifetime to reconnect with students from decades ago, to learn about their lives and what they've accomplished. These are really the blessings of my senior years. In 2005 and 6, son Andrew and his wife Andrea had moved to the country on a ridge between Sherwood and Newburgh in Oregon's wine country. They purchased the property through the realtor, Patty, who was working for Coldwell Banker at that time after her retirement from education, in order to establish a ceramic studio. Andrew was teaching art at Beaverton High School and wanted a place in the country where he could do his art projects. Well, within a few months, Andrew discovered that right across the road was a small vineyard, La Bonne Terre, and that Fred Newton on Sundays had a small tasting room that drew people that came and spent money. Well, within a few months, Andrew started logging the vineyard property, or what became the vineyard. He logged and pulled the stumps with a huge track hoe. We had giant burn piles, and his wife and I helped stack the limbs, and we cleared nearly 8 acres for an initial vineyard. The planting began with Pinot Noir and now has expanded to the present time with 24 acres of vineyard and additional property that is in forest reserve. Andrew's auto shop, where he was restoring Porsches and Volkswagens, was converted into a winery building. And then he built a 3,000 square foot ceramic studio where he established a second business, Novum Ceramics. He manufactures giant terracotta amphora, trademarked Novums or Novum, that are used for making wine, beer, sauerkraut, kimchi, and other fermented foodstuffs. He has recently been selling the Novums to a distillery in Merida in the Yucatan in Mexico. He shipped them to New Zealand. And because of his success in making wine, Greco-Roman style, in terracotta, he has spoken all over the place, Portugal, London, Florence, Italy. It's been a very interesting journey to watch the development of the two businesses. In this same period, our daughter became a fourth grade teacher and librarian with employment in the Westland schools. Daughter Anne Marie and her husband Casey live near us in Lake Oswego with their 3 sons. And son Andrew and his wife Andrea live at the vineyard with their 2 daughters and son. So it's been really a great satisfaction for Patty and myself to watch the direction that our children have taken, both in education, but also involved in business. Andrew leads a very complicated life. He has taught more than 20 years at Beaverton. He and his wife operate the vineyard, and they also have the ceramics business. Novum Ceramics makes decorator wares, retro style from the 1950s that they sell to a home interior company in Los Angeles. And they also market several other ceramic wares, including giant planters and other vessels, and art pottery through the tasting room at the vineyard. The Bank of Mom and Dad has stood by and Andrew and Anne Marie as they have taken on life's adventures. That's, I think, a really important part of the continuing role of being a parent as helping your children realize their dreams and ambitions. And we are very gratified to have seen that success. Well, I think in terms of reflecting on life, that friendships are mightily important. And there's a bit of a risk in talking about friends because invariably there will be some key personalities that I won't mention or will have overlooked. But I want to single out a few. Very important was the in-depth friendship I had with my mother and father and my two brothers, David and Mark. There are hundreds and hundreds of letters received from my mom and dad and my brothers over the decades that we interacted. We were located in different places. My parents on the south coast of Oregon, my brother David living in Corvallis and Salem in his law practice in Albany, and my brother Mark spending much of his adult life in Boston area where he'd gone to MIT and Harvard. Those were really important and nurturing family relationships and friendships. There were also some really invaluable teaching colleagues at Lewis and Clark College. In particular, I team taught with three different faculty members. First with Ed Florence, a botanist and field biologist with whom I had several enjoyable field course expeditions in summer session in the late 70s, early 1980s. And then team teaching experiences in the core program at Lewis and Clark with John Callahan and Curtis Johnson. John, an English professor, and Curtis, a Pamplin professor of political science, were really close colleagues and confidants of mine. I valued their counsel. I was thrilled with the opportunity to team teach with them, and their friendship over the decades has been enduring and very meaningful. Also, through Lewis and Clark College, I team taught with Ian Adams, a visiting professor from Scotland in the public administration programs. I interacted regularly with Don Balmer in political science and with John Bates early in my career, a very significant and important figure teaching business and economics, and later chairman of the board of trustees at Lewis and Clark. There was another round of friendships as well. I became, as a college student, close to my second cousin, Bjorn Gufang, who lived in Stockholm, Sweden. And in time, after lots of letter exchanges, I got to know Victor Gufang, one of his 6 sons. Victor has twice visited us in the United States. I hear regularly from cousin Victor via email, and Patty and I have visited with him and his brothers in Stockholm. Another important connections were my first cousins, Jeffrey and Douglas Giles from Bandon, Oregon, both pursuing careers in business and in logging and lumbering. Their friendship has meant a lot to me, as that with my cousin Stephen Beckham of Canby, Oregon. That was always an interesting name coincidence. Stephen was my brother David's roommate at Oregon State, and he has twin brothers named Dow and Decker Beckham. So that was an overlap of names and friendships. And my cousin Richard C. Adamson, a lawyer and judge at Shelton, Washington. Those were critical ties and people with whom I've shared dozens and dozens of letters. Now, friends. I think basic among those would be Brian and Suzanne Vector Wilkes of Middelhausen, France. Suzanne is my wife, Patty's cousin, distant cousin, but cousin nonetheless. We met Brian and Suzanne in France in 1970 in a very fortuitous way. Patty had a series of letters written by her great-great-grandfather, George Reeb, to his daughter who lived in Pennsylvania. Those letters in German I got translated into English through my efforts and those of a colleague at Linfield College. And in 1970, we traveled to Alsace to visit the villages where those letters were written. It happened that eventually we pulled up into the square of the village of Mittelhausen. I happened to park right in front of the house that was our target accidentally. I knocked on the door and introduced myself and tried to explain in as good a German as I could do in Alsatian France that I was a history professor and that I believed that my wife and her mother, who were in the car, were relatives of George or Jacques Vector. Mrs. Vector had significant doubts about this. And in the midst of the an animated exchange between Jacques and his wife and myself in the entryway, a young couple came bounding down the stairway and said, "Hey, what's going on here?" It was daughter Suzanne, who'd majored in English at the Sorbonne, and her British husband, Brian Wilkes, a graduate of Oxford University, who were then teaching in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, but happened that week to be visiting her parents in France with their children. That began a 55-year or more than 5-decade close friendship with Brian and Suzanne. We've traveled together to Italy. We've traveled in Eastern France. They have many times visited us in Oregon, as have their adult children, who most recently have lived in The Hague and in Florence, Italy. So that is an international collection, a connection that has been very important to Patty and myself. Another friendship was that forged starting in 1968 with Gordon Carl Bjork and his wife, Susan. Gordon was president of Linfield College, and he extended the invitation to me to join the faculty, which I did in 1969. The Bjorks have been steadfast friends for more than 50 years. They were at the hospital when Andrew and Anne-Marie were born in McMinnville. We have watched their 4 children grow up. We know their 10 grandchildren. They are remarkable friends who for the last 2 decades have lived in retirement in Santa Barbara after they left their positions at Claremont McKenna and Pomona colleges in Southern California. Another very important friendship has been that with Michael Mooney, who was president of Lewis and Clark College from 1990 to 2003. Michael came to Oregon from his post as vice provost of Columbia University, and we very quickly became very good friends. It was my joy to work with Mike on fundraising and currying relationships with friends and alumni of the college. In 1998, I was teaching in East Africa, and wonderfully, in the 8th week of the expedition, Mike showed up to join us to camp out for a week in the highlands of the interior of Kenya. He brought copies of the local newspaper, dried apricots, and updates from my family in Oregon. Mike and I team taught on seminars together on the Lolo Trail and also at Monticello, doing the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. Mike aided and abetted my career in remarkable ways, particularly in helping me be named the first Pamplin Professor of History and endowed chair at Lewis and Clark College. And during his tenure as president, I wrote and the college published 2 books, Lewis and Clark College, which was an overview history of the institution, and the literature of the Lewis and Clark expedition, published during the bicentennial. Another really important lifelong friendship has been with Clay Strauss Jenkinson. Clay, like Jordan Bjork, a mutual friend of both of ours, was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Clay is a humanist extraordinaire. He has traveled the nation lecturing, teaching, and writing. We met each other in San Francisco at a humanities conference in 1989 and immediately became friends. Clay was at that period teaching at Claremont McKenna, where he knew the Bjorks in Southern California. Clay is responsible for my appointment to the board of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. We have team taught for the Colorado Committee for the Humanities. We have team taught for Lewis and Clark College for 3 years during the Expedition Bicentennial. Clay is the author of many books, including The Character of Meriwether Lewis, essays about North Dakota, and essays about place in American environmentalism. He's also the host of the Thomas Jefferson Radio Hour. He is a role player, an actor. He can be Meriwether Lewis in buckskins. He can be Thomas Jefferson in evening dress. He plays the role of Robert Oppenheimer. He is also a highly successful role player of John Wesley Powell, explorer of the American West and the Grand Canyon of the Colorado. It's been my pleasure on several occasions to be the host of programs introducing Clay, but most of all, we exchange lively letters over and over again, even though he lives in Bismarck and I live in Lake Oswego. There are also enduring friendships with former students. One of those for more than nearly 5 decades has been with Jeff Ray of Boise, Idaho, who put together this video autobiography and with great patience has served as the editor and questioner to drive my recollections. And every year for decades, Jeff has sent the Beckhams a 50-pound box of Walla Walla sweet onions from his home country up on the Columbia Plateau. A really wonderful event. Other former students include Todd Burton, businessman, researcher, also a graduate student of Jordan Bjork at Claremont. Todd was one of my undergraduate students at Lewis and Clark. Another, Christopher Friday, who became a professor. He earned his PhD at UCLA in history with some of my mentors, and for more than 30 years has taught at Western Washington University in Bellingham. My former research assistant, David Adams, who majored in philosophy, earned his PhD at the University of Hawaii, and has written and traveled the world and is founder of the off-campus educational programs called Island Ecology. Stefan Aumack, my sidekick in many adventures, was my research assistant in history in the early 1990s, was the outfitter for the program I taught in East Africa in 1998. Stefan also accompanied us on the seminars on the Lolo Trail through the Bitterroots in Idaho. He and his wife, Amy, live on Fall Creek near Eugene, Oregon, where for nearly 20 years he's been the principal of a high school in the Eugene district. One other of a former student is the rock classical violinist Aaron Meyer. Aaron has entertained us. He's entertained our friends. He and his father have given concerts in the living room of our home at Nesquin. And several times it's been my pleasure and honor to introduce Aaron at his holiday concerts that have been held in Portland for the last 2 decades. Aaron is a star performer, and we've had the joy of working together in special benefits for Lewis and Clark College. And he's also played his fiddle with wonderful success at events at the Beckham Estate Vineyard. 2 other longtime associates that I want to mention as well that are really important in my life. One of them is attorney Dennis J. Whittlesey of Washington, D.C., with whom I worked on more than 20 litigation matters involving Native American tribes. Dennis has been a true friend and wonderful colleague. as we've brainstormed and problem solved and documented and litigated issues. And Dennis had the trust to take me as his expert witness inside the bar of the courtroom and to sit beside him to write questions during interrogation as well as during deposition. I felt, and many times I was attending law school firsthand and working in the courtroom and in deposition with Attorney Whittlesey. Another person also important is Dr. Charles G. DeRitter. Chuck was the Director of Educational Programming and Career Development for the Regional Office of the U.S. Forest Service for the Pacific Northwest. Chuck persuaded me to embark on numerous seminars, in fact, more than 30 of them field-based, where we traveled to Prudhoe Bay, we traveled to Southeast Alaska, the Rio Grande Valley, we studied the farm crisis in Iowa. We were all over the United States together, usually with 15 to 18 federal employees, addressing issues close up. Chuck DeRitter was a can-do-it person who really understood the value of field-based learning and stepping into the resource and learning from that. These are some of the special friendships that come to mind. These are people that helped shape my life and career. They have been enduring correspondence, and they're well documented in the archival files off my office.
Part of my life has been involved in the development of professional relationships that have developed into very important friendships. This started in the late 1970s when I was asked to serve on the doctoral dissertation committee for Rick Miner, a graduate student in anthropology at the University of Oregon. Rick was doing his dissertation research on prehistory of the lower Columbia River estuary. At the same time, I was working with the Chinook Indian tribe, the historical successors to the villages in that area. And Rick and I very soon developed a professional working relationship. He and his wife, Dr. Catherine Ann Topol, both archaeologists, created a company called Heritage Research Associates in Eugene, Oregon. And for the last 45 years, they have engaged in extensive archaeological and cultural resource assessments. And they brought me on board as one of their associates. The projects that we've worked on have been really intriguing. In the 1980s, we wrote several cultural resource overviews, or historical, archaeological, and ethnographic assessments for federal agencies. These included the Ochiko National Forest, Willamette National Forest, Siskiyou National Forest, the Prineville BLM district, the Salem BLM district. These were studies to help the federal agencies come to terms with the mandates of the National Historic Preservation Act and archaeological resources protection. In time, Rick and I did a lot of teamwork. He was the field archaeologist doing the excavation and testing, and I was the background researcher. So we did studies at Fort Orford on the southern Oregon coast, at Fort Cascades, Fort Range, Fort Luganville, and Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River. These were projects that dealt with the pre-Civil War presence of these U.S. military posts that I documented through extensive research and many days at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And then I would merge the textual records, the post returns, the cartographic and sometimes photographic information with the artifacts that Rick and his team were recovering on the ground. Quite a number of these projects were driven by the navigation lock and the new North Bonneville powerhouse in the Columbia Gorge by the Army Corps of Engineers.
Altogether, I believe I did 10 reports, most of them co-authored with Rick or with Rick and Kathy that related to that section of the Western Columbia Gorge. We did a study of early historic railroad development for the portage lines on both the north and south banks of the Columbia River. I did a study of the pioneer fish hatchery, the first state of Oregon fish hatchery that was located at Bonneville in the gorge. So these were interesting projects. Probably the biggest of all was a site that Rick did not excavate. It was a site on the north bank of the river in Skamania County called 45 SA11. Several hundreds of thousands of artifacts came out of that site, and the Texas firm that had the contract to excavate it was unable to carry through with the artifact analysis. So Rick, Kathy, and I were brought on board by the Corps of Engineers. We hired a team of graduate students at the University of Oregon, and eventually the artifacts were identified, curated, and we wrote a major report on cultural investigations at 45 SA11, an unnamed but major village site on the north bank of the Columbia River at Bonneville. Other projects have involved the Willamette Valley. Rick and I did a project on the Burnside Bridge, which is soon to be replaced in Portland with a new major project that will take 4 to 5 years to build. We worked at the Thomas Roy donation land claim, now the site of the giant Amazon warehouse at Woodburn, Oregon. The artifacts from that claim date back to the 1830s and the 1840s on French Prairie. We also worked on the Big Digger, the Big Tunnel project, the massive utility tunnel that was drilled under the river through downtown Portland, back under the river, and back out toward the Columbia River to transport wastewater and gray water and rain runoff in a more efficient way than overflowing into the Willamette River. So these are just some of maybe 30 some projects that I worked on with Rick and Kathy. They were wonderful collaborators, very much collegial in spirit, two really bright people, and they enriched my life tremendously with the research and writing opportunities that resulted in the many reports that we produced through Heritage Research Associates. In the mid-1980s, I worked with Robert Reynolds Sr., a marvelous artist and book designer for Graphic Arts Press in Portland. Rob Sr. Was the book designer for the volume I did called Land of the Umpqua, A History of Douglas County, Oregon, published in 1987. As he retired, I soon got to know his son, Robert Reynolds Jr., and his partner in graphic design, Letha Wolf, at Reynolds Wolf Design in Portland. They were secured for nearly 25 years by Lewis and Clark College to do the college publications, the magazines for the law school, the Undergraduate Alumni Association, as well as admissions brochures and other special items. So I started working with Reynolds Wolf, and ultimately they designed a whole series of books that I wrote. Lewis and Clark College, the literature of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Lewis and Clark from the Rockies to the Pacific, the corporate histories of Stimson Lumber and Hoffman Construction Company. These were projects that we worked on that produced major books. Then we had another relationship. Reynolds Wolf developed the corporate reports and continues to do so for nearly 35 years for the Genesee and Wyoming Railroad Corporation of Greenwich, Connecticut, and Rochester, New York. The GNW was a family railroad founded by the Fuller family to haul rock salt from a mine at Retzoff in upstate New York through to Rochester. From that modest 14-mile line developed an international corporation with 119 divisions worldwide. And while Rob and Letha were working on the annual reports for the G&W Railroad, my role was to provide historical research, to speak at the 100th anniversary of the Railroad Corporation in Rochester in 1996, and then to go to work at the Fuller Estate near Scranton, Pennsylvania. The Fuller family has a remarkable property, now in the fifth generation, that is administered today as a farm-to-table market operation, but it has bunking facilities for some 50 people, family homes, horse barn, lots of outbuildings, and a remarkable amount of history. So my role in working with the Fuller family and for Reynolds Wolf was to research and write the natural history brochures that are part of the educational programming, as well as researching and writing the exhibits that are today in one of the big horse barns on this property. So I had the joy of working with two really creative people, Letha and Rob, in both book design as well as exhibit development. These were rewarding relationships. And Rob and I were often in the field together. When doing the book Lewis and Clark From the Rockies to the Pacific, we sea kayaked the lower Columbia. We hiked the Lolo Trail in the Bitterroots of Idaho. And we attempted, insofar as possible, to have Rob shoot these stunning photographs at the place, at the day, as they were visited by Lewis and Clark and documented in their journals. So this kind of professional work involved not only research, but putting my boots on and stepping into history with a really wonderful colleague, Robert Reynolds Jr. I had an interesting life experience moving from research and writing and teaching about Native Americans into becoming involved in modern tribal affairs. And that transit from classroom to courtroom to council meetings began in the 1970s, particularly in 1973, when I went to Washington, D.C. with the small tribes of Western Washington to meet with members of Congress on behalf of terminated and non-federally recognized tribes in Oregon and Washington. Subsequent to the work in Washington, D.C. that started in 1973, I began working relationships with an interesting set of tribal leaders. And I want to mention just a few of those. Began initially with the Kuslo, Umpqua, and Siuslaw tribes on the coast of southwestern Oregon. And interestingly, my connection there was having grown up in Coos Bay. I lived a quarter mile from the tribal reservation and tribal hall. And I remember earning my first merit badge as a Boy Scout, I was working actually on public speaking and Indian lore. And the lecture that I gave to the Coos Bay North Bend Rotary Club when I was 13 years old was our local Indians, namely the Coos Indian tribe. Subsequently, I would represent that tribe as an expert witness in federal court. I would testify on their behalf before members of Congress. And my working relationships there were particularly with William P. Brainerd, longtime tribal chair, and interestingly, one of my mother's former grade school students in the 1930s. Bill and I became close friends, and we had a very good working relationship for several decades. In the late 1970s, I began work for the Chinook, Wahkiakum, and Cowlitz tribes as their expert witness in federal court. And I soon got to know two tribal chairs very well, Donald Meckles of the Chinook tribe and John Barnett, longtime chair of the Cowlitz tribe. We had many meetings, lots of phone calls, many exchanges of letters, and ultimately, with the advent of email, uh, electronic communications, um, these men were dedicated to trying to make conditions better for their tribes, which in until the early 21st century were not federally recognized. They were Indian. They had allotments on the Quinault Reservation. Their estates were probated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but the federal government refused to deal with them as members of a tribe. It was a really incongruous situation. So I went to work for Chairman Meckles, Chairman Barnett, and eventually for Lucille Maxwell of the Duwamish tribe to research and write petitions for federal acknowledgement to clarify their status and relationship with the government of the United States. Those projects for Chinook and Cowlitz involved more than 20 years of work, and for Duwamish, 8 years. Other connections that evolved over time included a friendship and working relationship with Helen Sanders. Helen, at age 95 or 96 in the year 2023, is a remarkable figure in Native American affairs. She was an original allottee on the Quinault Reservation when she was a child. She's one of the last survivors of the original allotment holders. She eventually became a timber company owner in spite of the opposition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She used her own skills and prowess to start logging her own allotments. Eventually, she was the largest individual landowner of timberlands on the Quinault Reservation. When I got to know Helen, she was the National Secretary of the National Congress of the American Indian. She served on the Cobell Commission on the adjudication of obligations of the federal government to tribes, financial obligations. Helen has just been a remarkable person. She visited my classes at Lewis and Clark College many times over the years and helped expedite the teaching of the Indian Law Seminar field-based program that Attorney Dennis Whittlesey and I taught through Lewis and Clark's Law School for quite a number of years. Helen would meet us at Chehalis. She traveled with us to Quinault. She helped expedite not only our connections with tribes, but the discussion of allotments, trust responsibility, reforestation, and treaty rights. Part of that circle also involved Catherine Jones Harrison, who died in 2023 at the age of 99. I got to know Catherine in the 1970s and work on restoration of Oregon tribes. She eventually became the longtime chair of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I also worked with the attorney, Rob Green, for the Grand Ronde tribe, and particularly with David Harrelson, director of the Chalu Museum and head of their cultural resources programs. David, interestingly, was a history major at Lewis and Clark College, and it has been my thrill to watch him develop a staff for cultural resources, archaeology, history, and really be a leader in the modern Grand Ronde tribe. Another remarkable connection was forged in the early 1980s with Susan Crispin Schaefer, who was for nearly 30 years chair of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua tribe in southwestern Oregon. Sue was a can-do person. She persuaded me to spend a lot of times on projects that I didn't think I had time to do. And this involved working on the tribal land claims case as expert witness, serving on the Umpqua Indian Development Corporation board, co-authoring the business plan for the Seven Feathers Casino, and helping in just numerous ways the tribe in its efforts to document its enrollment and to secure federal trust reservation lands.
The Carver tribe in Northern California also became a very important um, uh, commitment of time and energy. I worked particularly with the chair, Alvis Johnson, in matters that related to litigation and the U.S. Court of Claims over their tribal interest in the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation. I was involved with the Karuk in the matter of Ruffy's Rancheria and the efforts of the congressman to restore a tribe that did not exist in Northern California and to document that matter, and particularly to clarify for the Karuk tribe the matter of the Carcieri decision, which meant that a tribe had to document that it was, quote, under federal jurisdiction in 1934. And I handily carried out that mission for the Karuks and worked particularly with Alvis and the members of the tribal council. More recently, I've been working with Dino Beltran, who is the recently retired chair of the Khoi Nation Band of Pomo of the Russian River Valley in Northern California. Also, among long-term working relationships, not only with the late John Barnett of the Cowlitz tribe, but his son David Barnett, who was chair, William Ayal, who served as chair, and Patty Kinswad Glazier, the current chair. As a result of these many involvements over nearly 50 years or more than 50 years, there's been an interesting payback, and it came in a wonderful way. The Quinault Alatis, for the work that Dennis and I did on their behalf over the years, funded for $125,000 the Helen Sanders Scholarship at Lewis and Clark College and the undergraduate college, and the D. Terry Law Scholarship at the law school for $100,000. That meant $225,000 in endowment funds. The Cow Creek Band of Umpqua, in appreciation for the work of Stephen and Dennis, gave $150,000 for a scholarship endowment to the Lewis and Clark Law School for its Indian law program. And in 2024, the Cowlitz tribe sent a check to Lewis and Clark College for $100,000 to add to the Stephen Beckham scholarship endowment. So it's been a real thrill and satisfaction to see this wonderful tribute in terms of assistance for the education for succeeding generations of students as a byproduct or consequence of 50 years of work on behalf of modern tribal people.